Our application is now entirely ready. It works perfectly, except for one small detail that I forgot when I replaced my original stack layout for a table view. I have set the keyboard to numeric again on this entry cell for the amount. But you can see how in Android it also works. Now, if you see my emulator too small, it's because I've been doing something weird with my emulators lately, that they just appear super small, but you can see how it works here on Android as well. We've tested on iOS first. Here it is on Android working perfectly. So really our application is ready. By the way, here on Android, notice how we see something very similar, quite native to what we see maybe on some other applications when we use this table view. So I could create just some example expense, hit on save, and we see how it loads here as well instantly, and in the categories we see the category being filled. We see everything working just like on iOS. Now, what I'm going to do in this lecture doesn't really have anything to do with this application, but I do want to show you a scenario that happened to me a few months ago and how I solved it. So basically what I had to do is, instead of a table view, start displaying some elements, but they weren't static elements. I was making a request to the internet. And what I'm going to do actually is, in the new expense VM, create a new class, because my request to the internet was returning a list of a specific type. Now, this is not going to be the exact same type that I was retrieving from the internet, but I had something like some status class, and the status class, it had more things, but for sake of simplicity, let's just create a couple of properties in here. It had a name and it had a status in Boolean. So what I had to do is, after getting a list, now of course my class is already called status, let's call this expense status and the Boolean status. So what I had to do is get a list of expense status, and in the table view display in the label the name, and have a switch, for on and off, binding to the status. And so what I had to do is both know what the status was when I retrieved from the internet, and to update that status to match whatever the user is selecting in the switch. Now, unfortunately, as I showed you earlier in the table view, there is no such thing as an item source. There is no way to bind like you would on a list view, because like I mentioned in the previous lecture, this is going to behave more like stack layout, which also doesn't have an item source. But you can always do something that is going to result in pretty much the exact same thing as you would on a list view, as you would find on a list view, by implementing it a little bit roughly through C#. This may not be the best thing to do, but I wanted to explain to you this scenario more for you to understand how you would set some binding through C# if you ever needed it. Although I'm sure that it's going to be in very, very weird few scenarios, but let me go ahead and do something in here. What I'm going to have is, this is my view model, by the way, I'm in my new expenses VM. And what I will have is just a method to simulate download from the internet. So of course, in this scenario, we're going to have something static. We're always going to be having the same amount and the exact same observable collection. But let's just imagine that this is going to be a request to the internet, so you would know that this is not always the same. So I will make this public, and this is going to be void, and it's going to be get expense status. And it will go ahead and do something very similar to what the get categories method does. I will first go ahead and create an observable collection of expense status. And because this observable collection is going to be public, let me make this class public as well. And not forget to initialize this observable collection. So In this get expense status, I'm going to this observable collection to be cleared, and I'm simply going to be adding some expense statuses. So I will, add 2 or 3 of these expense statuses just for the sake of showing you what I want to do. So here we have it. This is going to be immediately assigning the values to the expense statuses. But in my own scenario, this was making a request to the internet, so I didn't know how many of these expense statuses I was going to retrieve. So of course, I needed to do some magic with C# to be able to do the binding to a table view. So let me go to my new expense page and let me do something very similar to what we did with the other views. I am going to create, in this case, a new expense VM. This is going to be my view model, and in the constructor I am going to be assigning this to what we have in the resources. I believe it's also called VM, my resource, and I'm going to get this as a new expense VM. So nothing new in here. I'm also going to override the onAppearing method. And what I was doing in my scenario is here on the onAppearing, first of all, every time I navigated here, I wanted to update those expense statuses. So from my view model, I would call the get expense status method as you would with any other method. So these would update the observable collection. So far, everything is working as we have done with list views. However, there is no way for me to bind that observable collection to my table view. There is a way to bind to a list view. There is no way to bind to a table view. At least not directly in the form of an item source. So what I did was do some iterations in here. Remember that the idea here is not simply to list the elements. Listing that would be quite straightforward. I would just iterate through the collection, the observable collection, and add a switch cell. So that would be the easy part. The hard part, or the somewhat tricky part, would be to set the binding. So let's do the first thing. I will simply make the iteration that I was talking about. I am going to get each expense status in the view models expense statuses collection. And so the first time, again, it's a bit easy. What I will do in here is simply create a cell that is going to be equal to a new switch cell. So just as we saw that we have an entry cell, there is also a switch cell that is going to contain a switch. And so let me go ahead and create the switch cell that is going to have immediately a text that is going to be es.name. So the one that I'm obtaining directly from the expense status from which I am iterating in this particular iteration. So nothing fancy in here. And I could do the same thing with the status. So from the cell, I could access an on status and I can set this to whatever comes from the ES. However, that would not bind any changes that the user makes back to my view model. So that is the tricky part. So here is what you have to do. Just like on SAML, the first thing that you need is the binding. So in here in C# you could also create a new binding. You remember that on SAML, that is how you start. You create a binding. So that is the first part. Now, if you remember, what we have to have in SAML is some binding context. So in here, for example, in this entry cell, because we already inherit the binding context in this case from the stack layout, we don't need to establish it. We don't need to establish the source. It is already established to that binding context. We go directly to the path. But for example, in our toolbar item, we do set the source first and then the path, which is some property from the source. So we have to do something similar with C#. First, setting the source. So the source for my binding could be this ES through which I'm iterating. But again, this would not be